The snow fell on Lander, Wyoming like a judgment. For 2 days it hadn't stopped, burying the world in a thick, silent blanket of white. The sky was a sheet of lead, pressing down, suffocating the sound and the light and the hope. On a warped wooden platform in the center of the timber yard, Ruth Whitlow stood barefoot. The cold licked at her heels, turning them a bruised, mottled blue. Her thin calico dress was a frozen rag clinging to her legs, a monument to her shame. The wind, a cruel and searching thing, slid under her shawl, prying at the frayed edges like it was looking for a secret to steal. She didn't flinch. She had nothing left to protect. The townsfolk gathered around her weren't there for comfort. They were there for the spectacle. They murmured and shifted, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their eyes hungry. They wanted to see how far a woman could fall. They wanted to know the exact moment she stopped being a person and became an object. Something to be bartered over, like a dented bucket or a rusted plow. Mayor Dunn, a man whose face was as empty as his promises, cleared his throat. His voice cracked against the heavy silence. 30 cents to start, he called out. Strong cook, clean, quiet. He paused, then added the final, damning selling point. No family to chase her down. Silence. A horse stamped its foot at the hitching post, the sound sharp and lonely. Somewhere in a covered wagon, a baby began to cry, its wail thin and hopeless against the endless white. A man in the crowd snickered. She's 30, he muttered, not bothering to hide the cruel curl of his lips. That's past pretty and well into problem. Doesn't eat much, though, another man chuckled back. Might be worth it just to get through the winter. The laughter that followed was thin and sharp, like breaking ice. Ruth didn't look at them. She couldn't. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the pine-covered ridge that clawed at the gray sky. A place of rock and wind, a place where silence lived without judgment. She used to go there, back when her father's hammer still rang out from their carpentry shop, before the debts, before the accident, before the whispers and the lies that had turned her from a wife into a widow, and from a widow into a ghost with a name nobody wanted to speak. She's handy with a fire, Mayor Dunn added, his voice getting louder, desperate. Kept a stove lit through 3 hard winters. Good with cornbread, good with a needle, hasn't touched a drop of whiskey, far as anyone's heard. He was selling her like livestock. A few heads in the crowd turned, a flicker of interest, but no one moved. No one spoke. The price was 30 cents, and even that was too much. And then came a sound. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a cough. It was the solid, deliberate thud of a single boot heel striking the frozen earth. Measured. Final. A figure emerged from the back of the crowd, parting the gawking townsfolk like a ship breaking through ice. He was a mountain of a man, carved from the same hard granite as the ridge behind him. He stood a head taller than anyone else, with shoulders built for carrying burdens far heavier than his own. His beard was thick and dark, frosted with ice at the edges, and his sheepskin coat was worn and dusted with snow. He wore his hat low, shading eyes that held the cold, hard emptiness of the winter sky. They gave nothing away. A whisper rippled through the crowd. Wyatt Callahan? Haven't seen him in town for 2 years. Heard he talks to horses more than he talks to people. Mayor Dunn blinked, thrown off balance. Mr. Callahan, you have business here? Wyatt didn't answer the mayor. He didn't even look at him. His gaze moved past the murmuring crowd, past the auction platform, and settled not on Ruth's face, but on her bare, blue feet. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. $1. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the timber yard. It was a sound of pure shock. $1. For her. $1? Dunn repeated, his voice squeaking. Wyatt Callahan gave a single, sharp nod. That's robbery, someone scoffed from the crowd. No, another voice muttered from the shadows. That's charity dressed in silence. No one else dared to bid. You didn't mock the one man in the valley who could break a wild stallion with nothing more than a stare, the man who lived alone on the ridge and answered to no one. Dunn hesitated, his eyes wide. Then with a shaking hand he struck the gavel. The sound was pathetic, a dull, sad tap that felt like something dying in a cold barn. "Sold," he croaked. "To Mr. Callahan. For $1. Ruth didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and a terror so profound it felt like stillness. Bought. For the price of 4 loaves of bread. She didn't move until Wyatt Callahan stepped onto the platform. He didn't reach for her arm. He didn't speak a word. He simply slid his heavy sheepskin coat from his own shoulders and draped it around hers. It wasn't a gesture of urgency or possession. It was done with a slow, deliberate care, the way a man might lay a quilt over a wounded animal he was trying to save. The coat was heavy and warm, smelling of pine smoke, leather, and the cold winter air. She gripped the lapels, her hands trembling, but not from the frost. For the first time, it was from something else entirely. Wyatt turned without a word and walked back through the silent crowd toward a simple wagon parked beyond the fence. And she followed. No one stopped them, no one cheered. The people of Lander just watched them go, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, as if trying to bury the moment, to cover it up before anyone could figure out what it meant. The wagon ride was a journey into silence. The only sounds were the groan of the wheels on the frozen road and the soft jingle of the harness as they wound their way up into the foothills of the Wind River Range. Ruth sat beside him on the hard wooden bench, lost inside the enormous coat. He had taken a folded horse blanket from the floorboards and tucked it around her bare feet. Another small, unspoken act of kindness that felt so foreign it was almost painful. She hadn't been truly warm in months, not since they'd pulled her father's crushed body from beneath the collapsed roof beam of his workshop. Not since her husband's family had stood over his grave and whispered that she was a curse, a low-born woman who had lured their son to his ruin. Not since the bank had seized the shop and the sheriff had taken her last pair of shoes as payment for debts that weren't even hers. And now this, bought for $1, cheaper than a bag of feed. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice a raw, broken thing, like scraped bark. "Why did you do it?" Wyatt Callahan didn't look at her. His gloved hands remained steady on the reins, his eyes fixed on the snow-dusted pines that lined the trail ahead. "Needed a cook," he said. The answer was so simple, so blunt, it felt like another kind of slap. A cook. That's all she was. A piece of utility. She turned her face away, back toward the skeletal trees reaching for a sky that had forgotten the sun. She didn't reply. What was there to say? Just before dusk, as the light began to fail, a cabin came into view. It was a single-story structure, tucked into a dense stand of fir trees, with a thin, steady trail of smoke rising from a stone chimney. It wasn't grand. It wasn't much at all. But it was standing. And right now, that felt like a miracle. Wyatt pulled the wagon to a halt beside the small porch and climbed down. He didn't offer her a hand to help her down. Instead, as she stepped carefully onto the frozen ground, he reached out and steadied the heavy coat on her shoulders, making sure it didn't slip. Her legs trembled, and she wasn't sure if it was from the biting cold or the overwhelming weight of being seen by someone without a hint of judgment in their eyes. He pushed open the cabin door and gestured for her to go inside. The warmth hit her first, a wave of it, rolling out from a crackling fire in a large stone hearth. It was so immediate, so enveloping, that she almost stumbled. Then came the smells, leather, pine smoke, and the faint, clean scent of tobacco. The room was sparse, almost monastic. A simple cot was pushed into one corner, covered with a thin blanket. A rough-hewn wooden table with a single chair stood in the center of the room. A shelf on the wall held a few tin dishes and a Bible, its cover worn smooth. Wyatt pointed a gloved finger toward the cot. "You'll sleep there." He took a step back, his broad frame filling the doorway. "I sleep in the barn," he said. "Most nights." Ruth blinked, confused. The warmth was making her dizzy. I thought you needed a cook." His eyes, shadowed by his hat, seemed to look right through her. "I need peace more," he said. And then he stepped back out into the swirling snow, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening quiet. Ruth stood frozen in the center of the room, swallowed by his coat, the firelight dancing across her face. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, no one was demanding anything from her. No one was judging her, or pitying her, or even asking for her name. He had bought her, brought her here, and then simply left her alone, and that somehow was the loneliest and the kindest thing anyone had ever done. But as she stood there, a cold dread began to creep up her spine. The barn? Why would a man sleep in a cold barn when he had a perfectly good cabin with a roaring fire? Unless he wasn't planning on sleeping at all. Unless this quiet, this kindness, was just a mask, a test, and she had no idea if she was meant to pass or fail. The silence in the cabin wasn't empty. It was heavy, weighted with questions she was too afraid to ask. Ruth stood motionless for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. The warmth from the hearth began to seep into her bones, a feeling so foreign she had almost forgotten it. Slowly, she shrugged off Wyatt's enormous coat, folding it with a reverence she didn't understand, and laying it carefully on the lone chair. She was still just a transaction, $1's worth of labor, but that coat felt like something else, a promise or a warning. Her eyes scanned the small room again. It was a man's space, stripped of all comfort save for the barest necessities. The single chair, the cot, the few tin plates. Who was this man who needed peace so badly he would banish himself to a barn in the dead of winter? What kind of ghosts was he running from? Her stomach let out a low, mournful growl, a sharp reminder of her own reality. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Her gaze fell on the small shelf. A few tins sat in a neat row. Cornmeal, beans, dried onions. It wasn't much, but to a woman who knew how to make something from nothing, it was a feast. She found a cast-iron pot hanging by the hearth and a small skillet leaning against the stone. Her hands, stiff and clumsy from the cold, fumbled with the matches. The first one broke, the second sputtered and died. On the third try, a small, brave flame erupted, and she touched it to the kindling in the stove. As the fire caught, she whispered a thank you into the quiet air, not sure if she was thanking God or the strange, silent man in the barn. The familiar rhythm of cooking took over, the measuring, the stirring, the quiet hiss of lard in the hot skillet. It was a language her body remembered even when her mind was lost. With each movement, a piece of the old Ruth, the carpenter's daughter who knew the value of her own hands, began to stir. She was no longer just a victim on a platform. She was useful. She was creating something. By the time a thick bean stew was simmering on the stove and golden corn cakes were sizzling in the skillet, the aroma had filled the cabin, chasing the sterile scent of pine and solitude into the corners. She had even found a damp rag under the wash basin and wiped down the surface of the wooden table. She stood there, her work done, caught in a moment of uncertainty. Was she supposed to eat? Was she supposed to wait for him? Was he even coming back? The question had barely formed in her mind when the cabin door creaked open. Wyatt Callahan stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He moved slowly, his boots thudding softly on the plank floor. He shut the door, then stood there for a moment, just inside the threshold, his shoulders dusted with fresh snow. He didn't speak. He just looked. His gaze flickered from the stove to the table, and then, finally, to her. His eyes, which had seemed so empty and cold in the gray daylight, now held a different light in the warm glow of the fire. "Smells like something real," he said, his voice a low rumble. Ruth didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. He walked to the peg by the door, removed his heavy gloves, and then his hat, hanging both with a practiced neatness. He sat down in the lone chair at the table, his big frame seeming to shrink into itself, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared into the fire. Hesitantly, she ladled a generous portion of the stew into a tin bowl and placed it on the table in front of him, along with 2 corn cakes. She then stepped back, her hands twisting in the fabric of her dress, unsure of her place. He didn't look up from the bowl. "Sit too," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She perched on the very edge of the cot, her back straight, ready to stand at a moment's notice. They ate in a silence that was thick and profound. The only sounds were the scrape of their spoons against the tin bowls and the steady, comforting crackle of the fire. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, not like the one at the auction. This was different. It felt respectful. She found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, the way his large, calloused hand curled around the spoon, the way he chewed slowly, deliberately, as if every bite was something to be contemplated, not just consumed. This was not a man who rushed anything. When he finished, he set the empty bowl down and pushed it gently toward the center of the table. He stood up, his shadow looming large on the wall behind him. "Good," he said. It was just one word, but it landed with the weight of a sermon. And then, just as quietly as he had entered, he turned, put on his hat and gloves, and stepped back out into the snow-swept darkness, closing the door behind him. He was gone again. Back to the barn. Back to his self-imposed exile. Ruth sat by the fire long after he left, the warmth of the stew spreading through her. She washed both bowls in the basin, dried them, and placed them back on the shelf. She moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in a year. She picked up the extra blanket from the cot and wrapped it around her shoulders, then sat in the lone chair, his chair, and stared out the small, wavy glass of the window. The world outside was a swirling vortex of black and white, but for the first time, she felt like she might just survive it. Then, her eyes caught something, a glint of metal near the base of the hearth, almost hidden in the shadows. Curious, she knelt down. It was a small tin box, rusted at the hinges. Her fingers trembled as she pried it open. Inside, nestled on a piece of faded velvet, was a child's silver locket. It was tarnished with age, and when she opened it, she saw it was empty. One side was meant for a picture, the other for a lock of hair. Both were bare. Who did this belong to? A wife? A child? Suddenly, the peace she had felt curdled into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The man in the barn wasn't just hiding from ghosts. He was guarding them, and she was sleeping in their house. The child's locket felt cold in her hand, a small, heavy secret. Ruth quickly snapped it shut and tucked the tin box back into the shadows by the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs. This cabin wasn't just a shelter, it was a shrine, and she was an intruder. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter outside. Was that why he slept in the barn? Because this room, this fire, this very air belonged to someone else? A woman? A child he had lost? Sleep did not come easily. She lay on the cot, wrapped in 2 blankets, listening to the wind howl and imagining the silent man in the barn, a sentinel guarding a tomb of memories. The peace he sought wasn't for himself. It was for them, for the ghosts. She woke before the sun, the question still burning in her mind. Habit, or maybe just raw nerves, pulled her from the cot. She moved quietly, building the fire, sweeping the hearth, her mind racing. She had to know. But how could she ask a man who barely spoke? She sifted flour and made biscuits, small, hard, and imperfect, but they were warm, and they were something she could control. When Wyatt returned from the barn at dawn, his arms laden with freshly chopped firewood, he paused in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the pale morning light. He saw her there by the stove, and for a moment, the air grew thick with unspoken things. He didn't mention the locket. He didn't ask if she'd slept. He simply placed the logs in the box by the hearth, his movements as deliberate as ever. He nodded once, his gaze flicking to the plate of biscuits on the table. "Smells like home," he said. The words, so simple and offered so quietly, hit her with the force of a physical blow. Home. This place was a home to him, but it clearly wasn't an empty one. She folded the dish towel in her hands, tighter and tighter, blinking against the sudden sharp sting in her eyes. The day passed in the same silent rhythm. She worked inside, he worked outside. The space between them was a chasm of things unsaid. She cooked supper. He brought in more wood. The pattern was a fragile kind of truce. On the third morning, she found a small cloth sack sitting on the table. There was no note, no explanation. Inside was salt, a luxury she hadn't tasted in months, a gesture so small and so profound it almost broke her. She added it to the stew that night, and when he took his first bite, a flicker of something, surprise, memory, crossed his features. His jaw loosened, just slightly. His shoulders, which were always held so ramrod straight, seemed to drop by a fraction of an inch. It tasted, she realized, more like something he remembered. That night, as she laid out her blankets on the cot, she found another silent offering. A second blanket had been placed at the foot of the cot. This one was thicker, made of flannel squares, stitched with a rough but sturdy hand. She hadn't seen him bring it in. He moved through the world like a ghost, leaving traces of kindness in his wake. Later, sitting by the fire, she found a tear in the cuff of his spare work shirt, which he kept folded on the shelf. With a needle and thread she'd found in a small tin, she began to mend it. It wasn't a task he had asked for. It wasn't a debt she was repaying. It was something else, a response, a quiet conversation held in stitches and salt. Because when you belonged to no one, every small act of kindness you chose to give was entirely your own. 3 days turned into 4. On the 4th morning, she was wrapping biscuits in a cloth for his midday meal when a sharp, insistent knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't Wyatt's quiet entrance. This was a knock that demanded entry, confident and unwelcome. She froze, her hands stilling over the biscuits. Wyatt was out back, tending to the horses. He wouldn't hear. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the impatient scrape of boots on the porch. Her heart began to thud a heavy, fearful rhythm. She opened the door just a crack. A woman stood on the porch, wrapped in a wool coat far too fine for a trip up the mountain. Her lips were a thin, disapproving line, and her eyes, small and sharp, were already sweeping the cabin, passing judgment on everything they saw. It was Cora Wilkes, the unofficial town crier and moral authority of Lander. Behind her stood her husband, Nate, holding a sack of flour and a jug of molasses, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Well," Cora said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I see she's adjusting." Ruth didn't answer. She just gripped the edge of the door. Cora pushed past her, stepping into the cabin as if she owned it. Her eyes took in the mended shirt, the extra blanket on the cot, the 2 bowls drying by the basin. Her lips curled into a smug, knowing smile. "Folks are talking, you know," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're saying Wyatt Callahan didn't just bring you up here to stir his stew." She leaned closer. "They're saying he's always had a soft spot for ruined things." The word ruined hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. Before she could find her voice, before the shame could swallow her whole, a new voice sliced through the tension. It was low, firm, and as cold as the wind on the ridge. "You're done here, Cora." It was Wyatt. He was standing on the porch right behind her, his arms folded across his massive chest. He must have come around the side of the cabin. He had heard everything. Cora spun around, startled, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. We were just bringing supplies. A welcome." "You're done," Wyatt repeated. His voice was even softer this time, but it carried a finality that was absolute. Nate, looking miserable, tugged on his wife's arm. "Cora, let's go." We'll be going now." As they scurried away, their boots crunching in the snow, Ruth stood rooted to the spot, her hand still on the door. She didn't watch them leave. She just folded the towel in her hands over and over again until her fingers stopped shaking. That night, the silence in the cabin was different again. It was heavy, charged with the ugly words Cora had left behind. When Wyatt came in for supper, he paused at the door, his eyes searching her face. She didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. "You should have let her finish," she said, her voice flat and brittle. He closed the door quietly. "You'd already heard enough." "I've heard worse," she shot back, a spark of the old fire returning to her. "I've lived worse." He walked to the table and sat down, his gaze unwavering. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look ancient and weathered, like a mountain. "You didn't deserve any of it," he said. His words were not spoken with pity. They were spoken as fact, a truth she hadn't allowed herself to believe for a very long time. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time since her name had been dragged through the mud of Launder, she thought that maybe, just maybe, he was right. She didn't thank him. Words felt too small. But that night, as she lay on the cot, wrapped in the flannel quilt he had given her, she felt a warmth that came not from the fire, but from somewhere deep inside. It was the fragile, flickering warmth of being defended, of being seen. And as she drifted off to sleep, her thoughts returned to the locket. He had a soft spot for ruined things, Cora had said. He had defended Ruth. Had there been someone else before her? Someone he couldn't defend? Someone whose memory was now locked away in a tin box, waiting in the shadows? The morning after Cora Wilkes's visit dawned gray and uncertain. The air inside the cabin still felt charged, as if her poisonous words were clinging to the log walls. Ruth moved through her morning rituals, stoking the fire, kneading the biscuit dough, with a heavy heart. He's got a soft spot for ruined things. The phrase echoed in her mind. She could live with being called ruined. The world had already branded her as such. What stung, what truly burrowed under her skin, was the implication that she was just another one of his projects. Another broken thing he had collected to fix, like a wobbly chair or a leaky roof. It cheapened the quiet kindnesses, twisted them into acts of pity. The door creaked open and Wyatt stepped in, shaking snow from his broad shoulders. He hung his hat on its peg, his movements measured and calm, as if the turmoil of the previous day had never happened. "Fire's holding better," he observed, his voice a low rumble. "I banked it tighter," she replied, not looking at him. She placed a bowl of hot porridge on the table. He sat in his usual spot and began to eat. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer peaceful. It was a careful, fragile thing, a silence of avoidance. She poured him a cup of coffee, boiled grounds and water, bitter and strong, and set it beside his bowl. He took a sip, his eyes on the fire. "You ever do any woodwork?" he asked suddenly, the question so out of the blue it startled her. She blinked. "My father. He was a carpenter." "Figured," Wyatt said, still not looking at her. "You fold towels too neat not to come from hands that know how to build things." It wasn't a compliment, not in the way other men gave them. It was an observation, a fact, and somehow that made it feel more real. It reached a part of her that hadn't been touched in years, the part of her that was her father's daughter, not just a ruined widow. "I helped him," she said, her voice softer now. "Sanding, hinges. I never took to the saws, though." "Smart," he grunted. "Saws don't forgive mistakes." A tiny, involuntary smile touched her lips. Later that afternoon, Wyatt was on the porch, methodically fixing a loose shutter that had been banging in the wind. Ruth watched him from the window as she scrubbed the wash basin. His movements were slow, deliberate, and certain. Every swing of the hammer, every nail he drove, had a clear purpose. There was no hesitation. The people in town saw him as a brute, a man carved from unfeeling stone. But she was starting to see something else. He wasn't unfeeling. He was just quiet. He spoke through his actions. There was a language in the way he stacked firewood, the way he mended a fence, the way he had stood between her and Cora's venom. It was a language without words, and she was slowly, hesitantly, beginning to understand it. That evening, when she set the table for supper, she placed a small, cloth-wrapped loaf of bread beside his bowl. She had used the last of the flour. With the tip of a knife, she had scored a small, simple X into the top. It was something her father used to do. A mark for hope, he'd called it. When Wyatt came in from the cold, his eyes landed on the loaf of bread, and they rested there for a long moment. "You bake too," he said. It wasn't a question. "I try." He broke off a piece, the steam rising from it, and chewed it slowly. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. After they ate in their now familiar silence, Ruth cleared the dishes. She was standing at the basin, her back to him, when he spoke. "Heard a story once," he said, his voice quiet, "about Cora Wilkes. She told her own cousin his new bride only married him for his family's cherry pie recipe." Ruth turned, a dish towel in her hand, and looked at him over her shoulder. "And that's supposed to make me feel better? Supposed to tell you she's a woman who's been talking nonsense for years. It's got nothing to do with you." She turned back to the dishes, her lips pressed tight to keep a small grin from escaping. "You have a strange way of making insults sound like lullabies, Mr. Callahan." "That's so?" he said, and she could hear the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. The next morning, a new surprise awaited her. Leaning against the outside wall of the cabin was a hammer, a small bag of nails, and a stack of mismatched, weathered boards. On top of the wood was a piece of parchment, held down by a rock. Scrawled on it in Wyatt's blunt, blocky handwriting were 5 words. "For shelves or firewood, you pick." She smiled. A real smile this time. She picked shelves. She didn't ask for his help. She dragged the boards inside one by one. The work was hard. Her measurements were crooked, and her hands didn't have the steady strength of her father's, but she worked all afternoon. The sound of her hammer filled the small cabin. It was the sound of creation, the sound of a woman building something for herself. By the time the sun began to dip below the ridge, 3 short shelves hung on the empty wall near the stove. They were crooked, they were uneven, but they were sturdy, and they were hers. When Wyatt returned, he stopped in the doorway, his gaze going straight to the wall. He looked at the shelves for a long time. "Level enough," he said finally. "They'll hold something. Maybe even books," she replied, her voice filled with a pride she hadn't felt in forever. "You got books?" "No," she admitted, "but it's good to make space for them just in case." He didn't answer, but later that night after supper, as she was washing the bowls, he walked over to the new shelves. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a tattered, well-loved book. Without a word, he placed it on the middle shelf. Then he turned and left it there. She dried her hands and walked over to the shelf. The book was a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, his only book, a story about a long, hard journey toward salvation. The days began to take on a new shape, built around these silent conversations. Firewood appeared, stacked neatly by the door. Socks she left to dry by the hearth would be mended when she found them again. When she used the last of the sugar, a bag of molasses would appear on the table the next day. A week after Cora's visit, a blizzard rolled in, trapping them in the cabin. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes. Ruth sat in the chair by the fire, mending the shoulder of one of his shirts. Wyatt stood by the window for a long time, watching the snow swirl, his back to her. "You don't have to do that," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the storm. She didn't look up from her needlework. "I know," she replied softly. "That's why I am." A log in the fire popped and hissed. The silence that followed was no longer empty or tense. It was comfortable, companionable. That night, as Ruth lay on her cot, listening to the storm rage outside, she didn't think about the whispers in town, or the shame of the auction block. She thought about the crooked shelves on the wall and the single book that sat upon them. She wasn't healed. Not yet. But something inside her, a wound she thought was fatal, had finally stopped bleeding. And for the first time since her father died, she dreamed of something other than falling. She dreamed of sawdust and the smell of fresh bread and a cabin where two quiet people could build a life out of the pieces that were left. The blizzard raged for 2 full days, locking them inside the small cabin. The world outside vanished into a swirling chaos of white. Inside, however, a fragile peace had taken root. They moved around each other in the confined space, their silence no longer a wall, but a shared language. He would read from his tattered book by the fire, his low voice a steady murmur beneath the scream of the wind. She would patch his clothes, her needle moving in a steady rhythmic dance. On the 3rd morning, the wind finally died down. The silence it left behind was absolute, profound. Ruth stepped onto the porch, wrapped in his coat, and gasped. The world had been transformed. Snow was drifted up to the windowsills, burying the landscape in a soft, pristine blanket. The pines sagged under the weight, their branches heavy and white. The air was so cold it felt sharp in her lungs, but it was clean. It felt like a new beginning. Wyatt was already outside, shovel in hand, clearing a path from the cabin to the barn. The rhythmic scrape and crunch of his work was the only sound in the vast white wilderness. She watched him for a moment, his powerful form moving with an unhurried, relentless purpose. She went back inside and began to make bread. Measure, fold, knead, rest. The familiar motions grounded her. But today, her hands hesitated. Her mind was louder than the quiet work. A terrifying thought had begun to bloom in her heart. She was starting to get used to this, to the warmth, to the quiet respect, to the feeling of safety. And that scared her more than anything. Safety was a trap. Warmth was a prelude to being burned. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Getting used to this place, to this man, was just setting herself up for more pain. Hope was a fool's game, and she had played it and lost too many times. That afternoon, while Wyatt was out checking his trap lines along the far fence, Ruth made a decision. It wasn't a choice born of anger or fear, but of a grim, heartbreaking practicality. She was a broken thing. Sooner or later he would realize it. It was better to leave before he did, better to be the one who walked away. She moved quickly, her hands shaking. She packed a small satchel, one of the flannel blankets, a few of the biscuits she had baked that morning, the scarf she had mended for herself. She wouldn't take his coat. That felt like stealing a promise. On the table, she left a simple note, written on a scrap of paper. "Thank you for the warmth." She paused by the door, her hand on the latch. Her gaze fell on the crooked shelves she had built, and the single book resting there. Her book. The one he had given her. A lump formed in her throat. With a choked sob, she grabbed the book and stuffed it into her satchel. It was the only thing in this world that felt truly hers. The cold hit her as she stepped outside. The sun on the fresh snow was blinding. She pulled her thin shawl tighter and started walking, her boots sinking deep into the powdery drifts. Each step was a battle. Each step felt like a betrayal. She didn't get far. He was standing by the gate at the edge of the property, 100 yards away. He wasn't blocking her path. He was just there, waiting. His coat was on, his hat pulled low. He had an axe in one hand, resting on his shoulder. He looked like a figure from an old legend, a guardian of the forest. He had known. Somehow he had known. As she got closer, she could see his face. It was impassive, carved from stone, giving nothing away. "Leaving?" he asked, his voice flat. Ruth stopped, clutching the strap of her satchel. "I don't belong here," she whispered, the words lost in the vast silence. "You think you belonged back there?" he countered, his voice still level. "On that platform?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and painful. She hesitated. His eyes dropped to the satchel, then back to her face. "You said you needed peace," she said, her voice growing stronger, defensive. I do, he agreed. Then I'm giving it to you, she said, her throat tight. What if I ruin it? What if I break it? He took a step forward, his boots crunching in the snow. He didn't look angry. He didn't look hurt. He just looked steady. Then it wasn't real peace to begin with, he said simply. She stared at him, the brilliant sun reflecting off the snow, making her eyes water. The wind whispered through the pines, a sound that was no longer lonely, but watchful. I've never stayed anywhere this long, she finally admitted, her voice trembling. Not since. I know, he said. The two words were filled with a world of understanding. Silence fell again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't empty. It was full of the things they both knew but hadn't said. I'm not used to being chosen, she whispered, the confession raw and honest. I didn't choose you, he said. The words were like a slap. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. He had just confirmed her deepest fear. She was a stray, an object of pity. But then he continued, his voice low and intense. I saw you, and then I asked you to come. She blinked, confused. What's the difference? Everything, he said. One's a rescue, the other's an invitation. She didn't know what to say. Her fingers, which had been clutching the satchel strap in a death grip, began to relax. He nodded his head back toward the cabin, where a curl of smoke was still rising from the chimney. Fire's still going. She looked past him, at the cabin, her cabin, the home she had started to build. Then she looked down at the snow at her feet, and finally, she looked back at him. Slowly, deliberately, she took a step, not toward the gate, but past him, back toward the house. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. He just fell into step beside her, his long strides easily matching her own, as if they had walked this path together 1,000 times. Back inside the warm cabin, she placed the satchel by the door. She didn't unpack it. Not yet. She went to the table and began to set out 2 bowls for their evening meal. Then she saw it. In the corner, where the single chair had always stood, there was now a second one. It was handmade, the legs slightly uneven, the wood still pale and new. But it was sturdy, solid. He had built it for her. When Wyatt came in, he took off his hat and coat, and without a word, he sat down in the new chair. His chair. And he left the old one, the one he had always used, for her. She served the stew, her hands steady now. He looked up at her just once. You staying? He asked quietly. She looked at the 2 chairs, the 2 bowls, the warm fire. I think, she said softly, I was always going to. That night she cleared the table, and he went to the hearth. He picked up the flannel quilt, the one he had given her, and draped it over the back of her new chair. It hung there like a flag, a declaration. Later, as she sat mending a shirt and he sat sanding a piece of wood, she glanced at him. The firelight played across his rugged face. Do you always build things that don't wobble? She asked. He looked up, his hands stilling. I try to. What happens when they do? Depends. On what? His eyes met hers across the small space, and the look in them was deep and serious. On whether or not it's worth fixing. She held his gaze, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I think it is, she said. He gave a single solemn nod. Later, when she was banking the fire for the night, she saw a scrap of parchment tucked under the edge of her plate on the table. She picked it up. Scrawled across it in his familiar, rough hand was a name. Her name. But it wasn't the name she had been born with. Ruth Whitlow Callahan. The ink was hesitant, almost shy, as if he wasn't sure she was meant to find it, as if he was just trying the words out, to see how they felt. She didn't say anything. She just folded the piece of paper carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. The satchel by the door was a reminder of a journey she could have taken. But the name in her pocket and the second chair by the fire were the reasons she would stay. The discovery of her name rewritten and joined with his, shifted something fundamental inside Ruth. It was more than a chair, more than a blanket. It was a claim. A quiet, tentative claim that she was no longer adrift, but anchored. The satchel remained by the door, a silent testament to the choice she had made, but the slip of paper in her apron pocket felt like a deed. The next morning, the air in the cabin was different. The silence was charged not with tension, but with anticipation. As she moved about, making coffee, stoking the fire, she could feel his eyes on her. He was watching her, waiting. But for what? She could hear him outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. The sound was steady, reassuring, the sound of a man building a life. When he came inside, his cheeks red from the cold, he didn't go to the table. He stood by the hearth, warming his hands. "I was thinking," he said, his back to her. "The land up here. It's good land. But it's lonely." She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. "A man I knew once," he continued, his voice a low rumble. "He said a house isn't a home until there's more than one heartbeat under its roof." He turned then and looked at her. The firelight danced in his eyes. He was talking about a wife, about children. Ruth's heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of her chest. This was it. The moment of truth. I don't know if I can be that for you, Wyatt," she whispered, the words tasting of fear and old pain. "I'm broken." "I don't see broken," he said, his voice firm. "I see strong. I see a woman who stood on a platform in the dead of winter with her head held high. I see a woman who can build shelves and bake bread and make a cold cabin feel warm." He took a step toward her. "The world tried to break you, Ruth. It didn't succeed." Before she could answer, before she could process the raw power of his words, he spoke again. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice dropping. "About this cabin. About this land." He gestured for her to follow him to the wall where her crooked shelves now hung. He ran his large, calloused hand along the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. "My father didn't build this place alone," he said. "He had a partner, a friend, the best carpenter in the whole valley." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "His name was Thomas Whitlow." Ruth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father?" Wyatt nodded. "They built this cabin together, years ago. They bought this land together. They were going to be partners, but they had a falling out, a stupid argument over a debt, a single dollar. A dollar. The world tilted on its axis, the price he had paid for her. It wasn't random, it wasn't charity. The dollar I paid the mayor," Wyatt's voice was thick with emotion. "I was settling my father's debt to yours. I was making it right." Tears streamed down Ruth's face, hot and silent. She reached out and touched the log wall, her fingers tracing the marks of the adze. Her father's hands had touched this wood, had helped shape this shelter. She wasn't an intruder here. She was home, in a way she had never known. "The accident," she whispered. "The roof beam that killed him." "Wasn't an accident," a new voice said from the doorway. They both spun around. A man stood there, framed against the bright snow. He was slim, dressed in a fine city coat, with dark polished boots. His smile was a thin, predatory slash in his pale face. Ruth knew that smile. She knew that cold, dead look in his eyes. "Silas," she breathed, the name like poison on her tongue. It was Silas Glay, her deceased husband's cousin, the man who had turned the family against her, who had overseen the seizure of all her possessions. "Hello, Ruth," Silas said, his eyes glinting with malice. He stepped into the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the scene, over Wyatt's protective stance, over Ruth's tear-streaked face. "Having a little family reunion, are we? How touching." "Get out," Wyatt snarled, his body tensing like a wolf about to spring. "Oh, I don't think so," Silas said with a laugh. "You see, this land, this cabin, according to the law, after my cousin died and old man Whitlow had his unfortunate accident, it all reverts to his estate, an estate which I now control." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on Ruth. "Which means this cabin, this land, And you, my dear, are all technically my property. That's not how it works, Ruth said, her voice shaking but defiant. In a town where the sheriff is on my payroll, it works exactly how I say it works, Silas sneered. I orchestrated that accident for your father, Ruth. He wouldn't sell me his half of the land. He was stubborn, just like you. The confession, so casual and cruel, hung in the air. Wyatt let out a roar of pure rage and lunged for Silas. But Silas was quicker than he looked. He sidestepped, and from his coat he produced a small silver-plated derringer. He leveled it at Wyatt's chest. Ah, he chided. Let's not be hasty, Callahan. I'm not here for you. I'm here for her. His cold eyes shifted to Ruth. You're coming back with me. You're going to sign over the deed, and then you're going to disappear. Quietly. She ain't going anywhere, Wyatt said, his voice a low, deadly growl. He stood between Ruth and Silas, a human shield. Is that so? Silas said, the hammer of the pistol clicking back. And what makes you think you have any say in the matter? You're just the man who bought her for $1. That $1 was a promise, Wyatt said, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. A promise I made to her father on the day she was born. Ruth stared at him, her mind reeling. What did he mean? You see, Silas, Wyatt continued, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. My father and hers. They were more than friends. They were like brothers. And when Ruth was born, my father made a vow. He named me her godfather. He made me swear an oath that I would always protect her, that I would always look out for her. He looked over his shoulder at Ruth, and the look in his eyes was one of profound, soul-deep regret. An oath I broke when I left town all those years ago, an oath I came back to honor. Silas just laughed, a high, ugly sound. A godfather? How quaint, a touching story, but a gun beats a promise every time. He aimed the pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. Now, Ruth, step away from him. But Ruth didn't move. She stepped up, right beside Wyatt, her hand finding his. She looked Silas straight in the eye, her fear burned away by a cold, hard fury. No, she said. And at that exact moment, the cabin door burst open. Standing there, silhouetted against the snow, was the town sheriff, flanked by 2 deputies, their rifles raised and ready. And right behind them was Nate Wilkes, his face pale but resolute. It's over, Silas, the sheriff said, his voice grim. Nate here told us everything, about the bribes, about the accident. We found the evidence in your office this morning. Silas's face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. He spun, the derringer swinging wildly, but he never got a shot off. A single deafening crack echoed through the cabin, and Silas crumpled to the floor, a dark stain spreading across the front of his fine city coat. Wyatt stood over him, a smoking pistol in his hand. He hadn't even flinched. In the stunned silence that followed, Ruth looked from the body on the floor to the sheriff to Nate Wilkes, who was staring at his feet. And then she looked at Wyatt, her protector, her godfather, the man who had come back from the wilderness to keep a promise he had made over her cradle. The law moved with a swift and final efficiency. Silas Glay's body was removed, statements were taken, and the sheriff, a man whose eyes held a newfound respect for the quiet giant of the mountain, tipped his hat to them both before leaving them in peace. Nate Wilkes mumbled a hasty apology, explaining that his wife Cora's gossip had finally gone too far, and his conscience had forced him to act. He had known about Silas's schemes for months and could no longer live with the silence. And then they were alone. The cabin, which had just been a scene of violence and shocking revelations, was suddenly quiet again. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the heavy weight of all the truths that had just been unearthed. Ruth sank into her chair, her legs trembling. A godfather. He was her godfather. The secret he had been keeping wasn't one of a lost love, but of a sacred, broken promise. The locket she had found wasn't for his child. It was meant to have been his gift to her, his goddaughter, on her christening day. A gift he never gave because his family had left town in disgrace after the argument between their fathers. Wyatt moved to the hearth, his hands shaking slightly as he holstered his pistol. He didn't look at her. "I should have told you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "From the beginning." "Why didn't you?" she asked softly. He turned to face her, his expression raw and vulnerable. "Shame," he said simply. "I ran away. I broke my oath to your father. When I heard he had died, and that you were alone, that you were being sold, I came back. But I didn't feel worthy of telling you the truth. I didn't feel I had the right. All I could do was try to fix it, settle the debt, keep you safe." She stood up and walked to him, stopping just before him. She looked up into his face, seeing not a silent, intimidating stranger, but a man who had been carrying the weight of a promise for 30 years. "You did more than keep me safe, Wyatt," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You gave me back my life." She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in both of her own. "My father, he would have been proud of you." A single tear tracked its way through the grime on Wyatt's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. In the days that followed, the last of the snow melted away, revealing the damp, rich earth of spring. The world was waking up, and so were they. The secrets were all out, the ghosts laid to rest. What was left was something new, something clean. One sunny afternoon, Wyatt finished the cradle. He had been working on it slowly, sanding every edge until it was as smooth as river stone. He brought it inside and set it near the hearth. It didn't wobble. Ruth had finished a blanket, stitched from soft gray wool. She folded it neatly and placed it inside the cradle. They stood there for a long moment, side by side, looking at the empty cradle filled with their shared hope. "It's a good start," Wyatt said. "Yes," Ruth agreed. "It is." That evening he came to her with the tattered copy of Pilgrim's Progress. He opened it to the inside cover. There, beneath the faded inscription of the original owner, was a new entry, written in his strong, steady hand. For Ruth. "My beginning and my end. My home." She traced the words with her finger, her heart full to bursting. He then pulled the slip of parchment from his pocket, the one where he had first written her name beside his. Ruth Whitlow Callahan. "I was just practicing," he said, a faint, shy smile touching his lips, "hoping it might one day be true." "It already is," she whispered. They didn't need a preacher or a church. They had the mountains as their witness, and the crackling fire as their blessing. They had built their union out of broken pieces, out of silence and secrets, and it was stronger than any vow spoken before a crowd. A week later, they hitched up the wagon and rode down into Lander together. They didn't go to the general store or the sheriff's office. They went to the small, clapboard church at the edge of town. Inside, they found the church registry. On a clean, fresh page, Wyatt Callahan and Ruth Whitlow signed their names, side by side. Not as a beginning, but as a confirmation of what they had already built. As they stepped back out into the bright spring sunshine, Ruth felt the warmth on her face. She was no longer the ruined woman on the platform. She was a builder, a survivor, a wife. Wyatt took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They climbed into the wagon and turned back toward the ridge, back toward the cabin built by their fathers, back toward the life they would now build together. Their story had started with a debt of $1, but what they had found was a love that was priceless. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and hope, and you want to hear more tales of the human heart overcoming the darkest of times, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered.